This little video is going to look at some of the differences between pre-war and post-war models, really to help you identify them if you want to. Far more details contained in each of these two books on Triang Minic models. The Minic book by Peter Bartok is beautifully illustrated and has many photographs of Triang Minic models. Minic Lines Brothers Tinplate Vehicles by Sue Richardson has fewer illustrations but has more detail on some of the differences between different models and different times. Even so, it's not entirely clear which are pre-war and post-war models, since some parts would have been left over from pre-war and assembled at the end of the war, and various items, some of which are identified as purely pre-war and some of which are identified as purely post-war, sometimes appear on the same model. It's just, I think, indicative of how production was, particularly in the immediate post-war era. Lines Brothers had closed down between 1942 and 1945 in terms of toy production, as they were given over to producing munitions and so on for the war effort, and production started again after the Second World War. Looking then first at some of the cars, one of the ways you could identify pre-war and post-war models was by looking at the bumpers, fenders for those in the United States, and the radiator system. So some of the earliest versions of certain models had the all-in-one headlight, radiator and front bumper that was commonly put on the long-nosed lorry as well. It's the same one also on the forward control models as well, such as the ambulance and some of the vans and so on. So that would identify it as probably pre-war. Post-war, you had separate headlights, separate radiator and separate bumper. It's three distinct parts. In terms of the rear bumper, the pre-war one had a combined luggage rack. Now these can't just be interchanged easily between the pre-war and post-war models, because there's a couple of slots that the luggage rack has to slot into on the body of the car in order to fit on it. So if you put a post-war bumper on a pre-war car, there'll be a couple of empty slots, and a pre-war bumper won't fit on a post-war car. The post-war bumper then is just a single bar really, and is fitted slightly differently on the underside with a couple of slots here on the base, whereas those slots don't exist on the pre-war model. They would be about here where my thumb is. Instead they come through the very end of the base plate. However, let's have a look at this limousine. It's got the all-in-one front radiator, headlight and bumper assembly, which would indicate that it could be pre-war, particularly as most limousines were produced pre-war. But at the back it has the post-war style bumper. So what does that make it? I don't know. Another thing that can identify pre-war and post-war cars is the type of wheels that they have. Most common wheels on these sort of cars are the tin wheels, and that would be both pre-war and post-war. However, some of them would have the cast wheels. Here's an example of a cast wheel. These tended to be post-war on whatever they were fitted on. Sometimes they'd be fitted with this kind of indented shape outwards, and sometimes they seem to be reversed, so you had this sort of smoother, more dome-shaped side facing outwards. Probably post-war then, if they've got these wheels. If they've got wheels like this that are in plastic, then you can be pretty sure that they are post-war. Here's an example axle, and these wheels inside this tyre are in fact black plastic. Black plastic or red plastic were sometimes used. On some post-war models as well, you got a wheel something like this, which is very small plastic sort of disc inside a different type of tyre. This is from a post-war traffic control car. With the Ford 100-pound car, the wheels here are plastic and tend to be identified with the post-war production. Pre-war production of these may have had thin disc wheels made of tin. I'll show you some examples of those. They'd be the same as on one of the small vans, so when I look at some of the small vans, we'll look at those disc wheels then. The later plastic cars had a plastic wheel which in some ways could look quite like the plastic wheel on the Ford 100-pound car that I've just shown you. However, it's not the same wheel. It's slightly larger diameter and it's quite a bit thinner. This is a shame, because if you're trying to replace wheels on some of the older vehicles, if they're missing, it would be nice to have been able to take them off the much cheaper and less collectible plastic models. However, they are not the same. Looking at these small vans, express delivery vans, Royal Mail vans, so on, these are very similar in size to the Ford 100-pound saloon, and also the wheels system is very similar. So first of all, looking at a pre-war one, this has the thin tin disc wheels that I was talking about. Here's one I've taken the tyre off. You can see just how thin it is. And that has a tyre which has like a kind of rut on the inside of it, and the edges of the wheel sort of slot into that in the tyre. It's a very unusual tyre. It means that you can't just use normal sort of dinky toy type tyres as replacements, although these are in fact replica replacements and they are available. Another thing about the pre-war early van, petrol can on the running board there, which of course might also symbolize that a car was a pre-war car, and a lorry is a pre-war lorry. So the Shell petrol can tends to indicate pre-war as well. And there's no rear bumper on the very early models. It's not broken off. There was actually no rear bumper on these models. On the later ones, we've got the plastic wheels, like on that Ford 100-pound saloon that I showed, and it does have a rear bumper. This is a Royal Mail van, and typically they would be GR on the side, George Regina, meaning one of the King Georges was on the throne. Ones that were produced ER would be pre-war, as they were actually Edward Regina before King Edward abdicated. They're not ER for Queen Elizabeth. So ER would indicate pre-war models. GR could be pre-war or post-war, but because of the plastic wheels, probably that's a post-war one, almost certainly. And this is a post-war Minic transport express delivery van with the plastic wheels, rear bumper. As with the cars, the later plastic vans, like the Morris van, they had these other type of plastic wheels, slightly larger, slightly thinner. Looking at some of the buses now, there's all sorts of details about the buses which change over time. I'm just going to look at a few of them. Firstly, the propulsion unit, as I shall call it. There's actually an older type of clockwork motor where just where my thumb is, there is no bump there for part of the wheel or one of the wheels of the motor to extend down into. This tends to indicate pre-war, the earlier form of the clockwork motor, which was a bit more fragile, I think, than the later ones. The inclusion of a little step inside the entrance door and an additional seat on it, you could have those any time, but again might indicate pre-war. Whether you've got London Transport or Green Line or both might be an indication, but I'm not going into those subtleties here, but Sue Richardson does in her book. The Bistow ad is common for the pre-war models, and there's no registration plate. Normally AYV 604 was the pre-war registration plate, certainly for the double-deckers. So with tin wheels as well, Dorking of course on the destination, I would date that as pre-war. This one's slightly more difficult. It has the earlier form of clockwork motor, no bump, and the livery is typical of pre-war models. Bovril on one side, Ovaltine on the other, and so on. However, it has the LBL 174 number plate. Now this was put on pre-war, but also post-war. With the Bistow commonly pre-war advert there, I would date this as probably pre-war. This one is definitely post-war. There's the bump for the later type of clockwork motor. Hope you can see that just behind the cogged wheel there. And that's the most common type of clockwork motor in the buses, with that bump on it. This one has the cast wheels, and again they're typical of post-war, and with Triang toys on the back, Penguin, Minic Cars adverts. These are all typical of the post-war era. Later came push and go models, and they're all post-war. No push and go pre-war models, so that's nice and easy. But they also have these ones do have the cast wheels, but you could find push and go models with tin wheels. Tin wheels seem to come and go all over the place. And a whole variety of different transfers, decals were used, and the 14 Putney route was introduced post-war, whereas pre-war it was the 177 to Mitcham, the cricketers, as the destination. This is a post-war single-deck model in the red and cream with push and go motor, so clearly post-war, cast wheels, typical. Could have really almost any of a number of transfers on the back. LBL 174, the most common number plate. Some later ones of these had Triang transport rather than London transport on the sides. Again, Triang transport decal would indicate post-war. Tyres can also be an indicator. These are reproduction tyres anyway, but because I thought it was pre-war, I've put the white tyres on. I think they look quite nice. Later they were generally replaced with the black tyres. But on the Routemaster, which of course is a post-war model, they actually had these sort of treaded type tyres, which are, I believe, similar to the Triang spot-on models tyres. Another oddity which you may find, not just on buses, although this is a lower deck bus part, this is actually from a very poor condition Routemaster, is that they've used recycled parts from elsewhere. This was probably in the post-war austerity era, so quite likely an early post-war model where tin plate from some other item, there's no way of knowing what it was, whether it was a toy or something else, has been reused, probably because of a shortage of tin plate, to make this item. Once it's in the bus, of course, you can't see underneath. You wouldn't know that it had been made from a reused something or other. With the lorries, generally use the same rule for the wheels. Tin wheels will generally indicate either pre-war or post-war, but cast wheels will probably indicate definite post-war. This is a tin-wheeled one, but is post-war. I know it's post-war because I was given it in the 1950s when I was a child. The other main identifier for it being pre-war is the petrol can on the running board. So they are generally typical of pre-war models. Tyres are very rarely original. Again, these are reproduction tyres which I put on, so the fact that they're white tyres are because I picked a tyre that I thought suited the age that I thought it was, so I can't derive the age from them. In fact, many pre-war models had black tyres. So here's another one. This is actually a little bit of a marriage since I got each of the two parts separately. But the shell can indicates pre-war, and the tin wheels indicate that could be either. Some of the painting on this one suggests it might be a New Zealand model, in which case it would be early post-war. Another thing that might help you distinguish between pre-war and post-war models is the box. However, it can be very dubious as to whether a box that is obtained with a model was the original box or not, as the boxes often get swapped about. This particular box here is the most common pre-war box for buses or lorries. For the buses it would come in a bigger version, that's for a single deck bus. for a double deck bus it would sometimes have the same size picture as that with a lot more white border to make it sufficient size for the double decker to get in. That same box could also be produced in different sizes for completely different models. Since the end flaps are missing on this box, I have no idea what it is for. It's slightly too small for a caravan. Could be a tractor or something. However, these boxes were also used in the early post-war period, so that's by no means a certainty that they're pre-war if they even came in these boxes. This is the most common box for the model cars to come in, particularly the more common cars like the Town Coupe, the Cabriolet and the Vauxhall Tourer, the Chrysler and so on. They would tend to come in that box, which has a slightly different illustration with more cars on it. The prestige cars, Bentleys, Rolls-Royce, Daimlers, tended to have their own boxes, but sometimes would come in a box like this one also, I believe. Commonly pre-war on some of the models then you also had a special box, including for the single deck bus, where it had its own lid on it. And that's clearly tends to identify it as pre-war. The most common type of post-war box has a sort of multiple vehicles in this kind of style, or one of these sort of styles. There's another one here. This looks like cars, whereas this one includes a van on it. Again, unfortunately, with the ends flap missing, I don't know exactly what models those are for. I picked them up just from being sold individually. And some of the boxes also had particular illustrations on them. This is a fire engine box. It's actually a reproduction, this one, and this would be post-war era.